very good afternoon to, in fact, very good morning to all the participants. Once again, welcome you all to the JSIA webinar series 2020. I hope you all are safe and doing well. It's the start of a new week, and we come up with a interesting topic. Uh, it's one of the topics that we plan to do in BA Honors Political Science. So the topic of today's webinar is why urbanization matters for politics, and this will be presented by Dr. Preeti Das. Post the presentation, Dr. Das will take questions on subject matters. And if you have any questions which are non-academic, I would be happy to answer those for you. I now request Dr. Das to start with our presentation, please.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Geeti Das. I'm an assistant professor of political science at JSIA. I also received my PhD from the New School for Social Research, where I also used to teach classes on globalization and gender and sexuality. And my research is on global and comparative politics, urban politics, and gender and sexuality. So today I'm doing a quick quick introduction to some of the issues in urban politics that are maybe not the most intuitive ones that you would immediately think of when you think about urban politics. So, you know, the issues that are sort of in the foreground, especially in a country like India, are things like urban elections, of course, but municipal government, infrastructure, and so these are all ways in which sort of cities are sites of politics. So when we're thinking about municipal government, infrastructure, policy, electoral outcomes, the division of public and private property, and also the politics of the rural and urban divide, we're usually thinking about the city as a place where politics happen or an object about which politics happens. And what I'm trying to do today is sketch out some of the ways in which cities and urbanization are also structures of politics, from patterns of settlement to urban forms, which I'll explain, architecture, energy use, and how we define what a city is. So it's not about how formal politics happens in cities, but instead it's more of a sketch of some of the ways in which cities are shaping politics and society as we know them today, and the formative role that they've played in getting us to this place of democracy and mass politics that the world now takes for granted, I think. And also thinking about how cities are not actually always cities don't operate in tandem with nation states, right? So first I'll talk a little bit about problems of definition. So definitions of cities have included criteria like population size and density. So, you know, what percentage of people live per square mile or square kilometer, or what number of people live per square mile. Land cover, which basically refers to what is materially happening on the surface of the planet. So is there concrete? Is there paving? Is there agricultural land? Is there uncultivated land? And based on whatever is happening on the surface of the planet, you would classify the land accordingly. And economic activity, of course, and infrastructure systems. Definitions of urbanization, the process of something becoming a city, typically use the growing share of population living in urban settlements. Now, it's important to understand urbanization is not just about urban population growth. It's the distinction between normal, so what we would sort of call normal or natural population growth just as a result of reproduction versus population growth as a result of migration, resettlement, or the change in a particular area of land that was rural becoming urbanized. So essentially, if you have a city that is perfectly static, in the sense that people are reproducing, they're finding housing and so on, but nobody is moving there and the city itself is not expanding in any way, that's not considered urbanization. Urbanization is about the share of the population of the total country that is living in urban settlements. So it's about the expansion of urban settlements and the movement of people. Changes in land use are a big part of that, and types of economic activity, of course. But the problem is these definitions are not standardized. So different countries have vastly different definitions. And that makes data on cities and urbanization very difficult to compare and generalize. So I can't take data on a Swedish city and an Indian city and compare them. I would have to disaggregate whatever data there is by things like, and control for things like population differences. Um, Population is the biggest difference, in fact. And then I would be maybe able to compare. But the one thing that people do agree on, even though none of these other definitions are standardized, is that a city is a political unit. In other words, governments decide under some constraints what a city is. So, in Sweden, for example, 200 people can form an urban settlement, whereas in Mali, the threshold as of 2009 was 40,000. Right? So, depending on how you set that threshold, what you do or don't define as a city will vary. And a city is also a political unit in the sense that it's a bureaucratic unit, it's an administrative unit. It usually has its own autonomous administration for matters that are considered municipal. So I'll talk a little bit about why the history of urbanization matters for politics. Um, this is a picture of a leopard near Mumbai. So I don't know if how many of you are aware of this, but Mumbai used to be a natural. Mumbai is near a natural habitat for leopards, and with changes in human land settlement, they have actually learned to come into the city at night and get their food that way. And so now they survive off the city. So most of the world's largest and most well-known cities actually predate nation states, right? Nation states at the time that they were formed, whether it was through the Treaty of Westphalia or through decolonization, had to work around pre-existing structures, like what the land ownership was like, who was in power, what the existing social stratifications were, and also where the cities were, because cities were seats of power. They were hubs of economic activity, and they were places where local economies would connect up more to global ones. So there were some cases where capital cities in particular were relocated, especially in post-colonial, by colonial powers and in post-colonial countries. So several countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia in the 20th century shifted capital cities. Sometimes it was a very strong symbolic gesture as a rejection of the colonial past to say, no, we are a completely different country now, and we have our own identity, right? But this is rare. Most of the world's major cities have been historically continuous, and they've been around for a very long time. So because of that, as you can imagine, people like to write about where they live, and cities also have tended to house universities. So we have no shortage of urban history. That is, histories of specific cities, especially the ones that are more prominent and powerful. Um, what we do have a shortage of is histories of urbanization. That's because it's extremely difficult to write a generalized global theory of how and why cities develop. Some people have tried. There's no sort of universal agreement, really. But in order to do this, they're also relying on specific urban histories and then connecting them to their own frameworks, right? You have to have some kind of pre existing economic understanding and political understanding in which to fill in the gaps in information as well and interpret and speculate. And so, which framework you choose and which urban histories are accessible to you will have different implications for how you do the history. And that in turn has different implications for how we understand politics. So I'll give you two frameworks and talk about their political implications a bit. And I think the difference between these two frameworks actually really contributes to one of the major contemporary issues that cities all around the world are facing. Excuse me. So global urbanization is typically divided into three stages. There's the pre-industrial phase, which is the classic idea of ancient and medieval cities. These, we'll come back to this later, but they typically had walls around them. They were almost like an expanded sort of castle compound kind of space. Um, and of course, no industrialization. Then you have the industrial city, for which Dickensian Victorian London is the kind of ultimate prototype. And then you have metropolitan cities, which is what we think of now as a city, right? Which is tapped into the global economy, which has an IT sector, which is digitized, which has easy flows of goods and information and people on a scale that economic globalization has allowed. The idea of three stages defined in this way is a primarily economic framework. And it only really works in this three-step way for countries that had a strong industrialization phase in the 19th century. So in India, for example, it's a little bit more complicated because of how we were integrated into the British colonial economy, right? India wasn't a country at the time. It was part of the British Empire. And while we were connected to European industrialization, the connection wasn't that India was a major site of it in the same way as say London was. Our cities didn't work like that by and large, but instead we produced raw material, and we were made to produce raw material that the British extracted for their industrialization. So that makes it a little bit more complicated to think about, 19th century as just industrial. Another way to look at it is less in terms of the economic organization of society and more in terms of energy use. And then energy use impacts politics and economics. This also lets us think about how agriculture and fuel shaped cities. So there's an argument from a political scientist and I called Timothy Mitchell, and he says that basically the more concentrated our forms of energy became, the denser our human settlements, and the more dispersed, the further away from forests, the more dense, and the more mobile and connective. So basically, the model is this: we used to rely on renewable sources of solar energy. Everything was derived from renewable solar energy. So we relied on animals we relied on plants and wind and water. In the 18th century, the discovery of coal as a means of fuel completely revolutionized economic activity, right? And was essentially the fuel for industrialization. And so as we moved to coal-based economies, it enabled the creation of denser urban spaces because coal is a much more concentrated form of energy. So if you're transporting, say, a truckload of wood versus a truckload of coal, you're getting a lot more energy from the coal, and that enables a great deal. That enables a great deal more in terms of economic activity, but it also requires more people to move out of the countryside in order to work in producing and mining coal, right, and transporting coal. And then we move from coal to oil. So coal and oil being both carbon-based forms, and oil is even more energy dense than coal. Um, the increasing density of our energy forms also allowed the increasing density of our human settlements. And that, he says, produced a kind of mass politics because the sheer density, the sheer number of people produced certain political and economic crises, right, especially around factory work and mining, that then led to mobilizations that were negotiate. His argument is that countries became more democratic as they had to negotiate these demands and conflicts around labor in particular, and especially mining. So that sets the stage for what we now think of as democratic politics. The idea of political representation comes out of those movements in the 19th century and then extends all over the world. There are two implications of which of these frameworks you choose. Okay? So in urban planning in theory and in most popular understandings, metropolitan areas in richer countries are usually seen as global cities, right? So these are ideals, models, prototypes for others to follow, while those in poorer countries are seen as megacities. And the idea of a megacity is usually kind of a negative idea, right? It's overflowing, it's overpopulated, it has too many problems, it's out of control, it's filled with cataclysmic crises. Now, given how coronavirus is affecting New York City today, right? New York City being, of course, a global city, we can see one example of how this division really doesn't hold up. The problem is that even when we talk about the written histories of cities, the ones that have been best recorded and best preserved were mostly in the global north. Until fairly recently, academic knowledge production dominated in global north countries. And so global north theories have been produced, and urbanization has been understood from and about Europe and the US predominantly. And so they haven't actually managed to account for several ground realities. And in India, the biggest one of those is informality. Most theories assume formality. And we are now in an era, I think we're now at a time when a lot of thinkers from the global south are producing new theories of informality. But this is very, very recent. So all the history of urban planning, urban design, all the literature about governance came from these, because it came so heavily from these sources, it reproduced those assumptions. The other implication has to do with environment. So, how you think about the history of urbanization has implications for how you think about concrete questions about politics and development. Like, how do you create new cities? What pathways do you follow? Why some models and theories don't seem to work in some contexts, even though they work wonderfully in others? Who's being left out of these theories and models? And how do you choose which countries and cities you can actually compare and which ones you can't, right? What are the criteria? So, for example, take Singapore and Malaysia, which occupy the same landmass, right? Singapore has been hugely economically successful. Malaysia has not, and Malaysia struggles to keep up. Um, and Malaysia depends in some ways on a good relationship with Singapore. Now, there have been lots of theories in economic development, but urban history is a big part of that because Singapore essentially had the means to pursue certain kinds of strategies of growth, and it had the capital to do so, and it had the business structures to do so because Singapore was historically a port, and it was a significant port city under colonialism. And because it was founded as a colonial port, actually, um, it already had the structures to plug into the global economy after colonialism. So earlier models, as I said, focused on economics, and that focus on economics led to a certain kind of thinking about urban development. Sustainability models, on the other hand, take energy production, distribution and use, and agrarian economies and the connection to them into account. So that's one example of why how you think about urbanization and urban history makes a big difference for the kinds of politics and policies that you will then generate. So the second thing I wanted to talk about is why forms and patterns of urbanization are important. This is sort of a classic piece by an urban thinker who thinks about this. He calls it the city as an egg. And he says that ancient cities were like boiled eggs. You had a compound wall, you had the center of power here, and everybody else sort of lived dispersed here. And these were small, dense, tightly controlled settlements, right? There was a boundary wall and an entryway. Then he says they turned into fried eggs. So the development of armaments led to less of a need for a thick boundary wall. Cities were no longer necessarily walled as much. They were patrolled, and the borders consisted of people posted in order to control entry and exit. And so he calls this more like, he says this is more like a fried egg, right? The city could expand outwards as needed to accommodate more people and more activity, more cultivation, more livestock, whatever you needed. And then he says the modern city is a scrambled egg. It doesn't fit any of these things. Power and seats of power all over the place, right? Think about contemporary cities, right? The bureaucracy will be located in one place. The business elites will be located in another place. The technological hubs will be located in another place. The cultural hubs may be in another place, and so on, right? Now, there's a new form of urbanization that has come to dominate in about the last uh, 40 years, and it's challenging the way that urban governance work. And this challenge, it comes in the form of what we call satellite cities or satellite towns, or some people have called it polycentric urban development. Now, older models of urban planning and policy assumed that a city was fairly coherent and a self-contained political unit. It interacted with other areas and with other cities and with the nation state, but it could be internally governed when it came to municipal matters. So the political question was more, what is a municipal matter versus what is a matter for the state or national government? However, until we can learn to rip the fabric of space-time, right, cities can only grow horizontally or vertically. So these models tended to forecast straightforward growth in both directions, what they used to call a pouring sand model of city growth. The idea is if you pour sand from above, right, the middle gets taller and then you expand outward as well. But in fact, major metropolitan areas nowadays are growing on a satellite model, and they're being planned on a satellite model. So new townships and settlements come up near cities, but they're not physically continuous with them. They connect to them through transport infrastructure. This happens especially strongly in areas where there are major international airports. If you have a major international airport, chances are you will have a plethora of satellite towns because the towns don't need the towns also don't need to connect as much to the city itself. They can connect to the airport. Um, and entire economies come up, like small urban economies come up around airports. So this means that a metropolitan area will cover multiple jurisdictions. No single city government actually controls the full metropolitan area, because the metropolitan area will also fall outside of those city borders. The infrastructure networks that serve them are then often not integrated. Local governments then have to learn to collaborate and negotiate. And this is often done through contract formation, and sometimes it's done with the help of the private sector. So, for example, the Delhi Metro is a good example of partnerships between the Delhi and Haryana government being negotiated through the DMRC, but also through private sector entities until the Gurgaon Rapid Metro failed. But private sector entities play a crucial role because sometimes they are actually able to kind of broker these agreements or resolve these resolve conflicts, while local governments are also still accountable to their constituents. Another way in which the form of the city matters is in a very sort of everyday way, which is how you see the city and how you understand it. We process visual information by learning to see patterns. So you look at anything and you are mentally organizing it. We're mentally organizing a world of chaotic visual stimuli. Um, we make sense of a city and learn to navigate it through understanding forms and structures. And if you live in a city, you probably have a mental map of at least parts of it, even if it's your own street, even if you tend to get lost when you go out, even if you rely on other people to take you around. You understand places through these mental maps. And this idea of mental maps came from urban planner Kevin Lynch, who essentially produced this prototype over here, which has guided the bulk of urban design and urban planning ever since the 60s. And so his idea was that everybody forms an image of the city with these 5 types of elements. There's a path, which basically is any way that you can travel. It doesn't have to be a formal road, but just any pathway that presents itself to you that you feel you can walk down. An edge, where something creates a kind of barrier. Right? Anything that functions as a barrier. Sometimes these barriers can be visual, right? So there are actually studies that show that if you create a sunken plaza, for example, if the stair height is too deep, people won't go there. People will actually avoid it, and so that automatically creates a kind of edge, even if no boundary has been created. Districts, so these are what we think of as neighborhoods, right? They're a little bit sort of porous, but or sometimes they may be gated, but again, they have their own kind of distinct identity. Nodes are places where multiple pathways meet. So any sort of busy intersection is a node. And then landmarks. Landmarks are, buildings, features that have a particular type of identity that everybody easily recognizes, right? Whether it's I don't know, it's a multiplex or a small mountain um, or a historical building or a statue or whatever, right? Landmarks um, help people orient themselves. So these elements can be formed of anything, whether it's constructed or natural, whether it's physical or in some cases social and visual. Um, and these shape and limit how we move in our everyday life, right? And they shape things like our supply of goods, our access to goods, our access to each other, how we interact with our neighbors, how we form what is called civic sense. How does social capital form in neighborhoods, right? How do communities become communities? Urban politics really, the urban form really determines a lot of that in urban politics. And these also, and that's a longer sort of way in which cities structure politics. There are also 2 major contemporary features of global cities or large cities. Um, One is militarization. Cities are increasingly and very heavily militarized now with both police and armies. So these features of the city, where the nodes are, where the landmarks are, where the pathways are, will then affect how that militarization is planned and dispersed, right? Where the police personnel and cameras are stationed, which areas are more or less heavily policed. And the other thing that they determine is mobilization, where and how people can gather to voice their opinion or protest or hold rallies or put up graffiti or demonstrations, public meetings, blockades, and so on. This is an image from the Hong Kong protests for democracy, the umbrella movement, where you see both the militarization and the mobilization in one image on a road. Okay? And the last thing I wanted to discuss is the visual politics of cities. So, what do I mean by this? Cities construct their own images of themselves. This is a picture of a statue of Godzilla in Tokyo. And I assume all of you know Godzilla, but just in case you don't, the Godzilla movies are about this gigantic lizard that terrorizes Japan, and basically it's enormous and it comes and it destroys Tokyo. And the Tokyo government has actually authorized the establishment of these statues as part of Tokyo's identity. So there are two factors at work nowadays with sort of the way with the visuals of a city. In some ways, the world's major cities are starting to look very alike. The global circulation of prototypes and material, and also of images and of culture and media, and the growth of a global middle class have contributed to a lot of spaces looking similar, right? The same companies will sell the same park benches in Singapore and in Delhi. Or the same subway cars, right? These things become more and more standard because the same companies are making them, and then cities will design their systems around the size of the subway car. The subway car may come from somewhere else, right? Or the prototype may come from somewhere. Informal marketplaces, same thing, right? Because now even the most informal marketplace is usually, if in a country that's not isolated, is usually tapped into a global economy. So things come in the same kinds of plastic containers and the same bags, and those same materials get repurposed into building the market. And so even marketplaces and the most informal marketplaces in urban areas are starting to look like each other because they're using the same material. Cafes, everybody knows the aesthetic of cafes and co-working spaces, right? There's a certain kind of hipster aesthetic with a particular type of wood or exposed bulb light fixtures. These things are not, I mean, nobody has sat down and said, this is what a cafe needs to look like, right? But why has it happened? It's happened because it catches on in one place, and then global media enables a particular kind of circulation so that the same aspirations get taken to other places. So even in places where the material is not necessarily already being circulated, and there's no government involvement in crafting spaces, there is still this homogenization. Car parks, street lights, security cameras, signage, road painting, park benches, and so on. All of these are becoming more standard across the globe. Since that's happening, governments need to do a lot more in order to try and distinguish their cities, right? To say there is something special about our city. Why? Because they want to attract tourism and business. So if you want to attract investors, if you want to attract businesses to come and set up shop, and if you want to draw tourists, you have to market in slightly different ways. And so there's all of these go into shaping the strategies that governments use in order to market themselves, in order to market their cities. And the way that they market their cities will also be shaped by where they see the potential to build economic connections. So not everybody is going for quite the same aesthetic, right? Some people are going for, I think some places will be going for this very sort of familiar aesthetic that I think we see in India. And there are places like, there are a couple of cities in Malaysia, for example, where that hasn't actually been the aesthetic goal at all. So they're not going for this kind of modern city image, but they're actually trying to attract Saudi investors and catering to what they think their aesthetics are. And that leads to a very different kind of city fabric in a place like, say, Putrajaya or Dompak. And so the kinds of visual strategies that designers and planners and governments will use will be based on where they see the potential for economic connectivity or connection. We don't typically think of this as a kind of nationalism, right? But it is still building a type of national identity through visual means, and it's doing it through the city. And I wanted to show you three examples of city branding. So this is ways in which cities differentiate themselves. So Lyon had this campaign called Only Lyon. And it's a very straightforward example of using physical logos to market a city through statues and public square installations. Dubai is sort of if you read anything about city branding, Dubai will always come up in every article that you read, probably. Because Dubai has done a very, very far-ranging, integrated form of city branding. So they have their campaigns. They have a bunch of YouTube campaigns. They had a whole YouTube story with Shah Rukh Khan, but they also use and many other cities are doing this as well. They use what are called star architects. So these are global architecture firms, mostly from the US and Europe, who have a certain kind of, who are celebrities in their own right, and they come and they create these kind of fantastic buildings, and the fantastic building becomes part of the city identity. And so in Dubai you get all these fantastic buildings that emphasize wealth and technology. And then you have Amsterdam, where they have this logo, this slogan, I Amsterdam, which has both plain red and rainbow versions. And the rainbow version is drawing on LGBTQ politics in order to communicate something about the city identity, which is to say that Amsterdam is inclusive when it comes to gender and sexuality. So I will stop here for now, but these are just some of the ways in which cities are structuring politics as we know it today. There are many others, but I just wanted to keep it to these three for now. And yes, thank you very much. And we can open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das, for the very informative session on urbanization, combining it with politics. And I'm sure our participants have taken a lot of understanding from this particular presentation. So now I open the question answer session. I would request and invite questions related to the topic. Also, if you have any questions related to the admissions or any other process application, you can write those questions too. While I take questions, I was listening to your conversation and presentation, and I have a question for you. In
Mm-hmm.
India, we see this. Nowadays we have the smart cities coming up in India, and
Mm-hmm.
how do you think this will affect Indian politics? Considering now we will have more spread of economic activities, like we have resembled, the scrambled egg. So now we will have the economic activity spread amongst even in the smart cities. So my first question is, how will this affect the Indian politics? And second is, do you see a change in electoral system with this kind of development?
Okay. Sorry, the second question was, do I see a change in the electoral system?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Um, so for the first question, the smart cities question, there's a lot riding on this, I think, and we're already seeing a great deal of political change in the form of, the kinds of connections that places now have to metropolitan areas where they had previously considered themselves rural. Um, but one thing that has been happening, and I think we see this actually in Sonipat, right, where our university is based, is that allegiance is uneven. So there are many people who will live and work in Sonipat who have an urban identity and a sense of urban connection to Delhi, and others who don't. And so there is a kind of political division that is happening within those spaces. Um, and because many smart cities are following a similar model, right? The challenge for them is the same as the challenge for us. That, in a sense, I think it's also up to people to shape smart cities, right? It's not just a top-down thing. But if you move into an area like that, then what do you do in order to connect to the pre-existing communities, right? How do you interact with them? What kinds of assumptions do you bring in? All of these things will affect the place. So Jindal, for example, I think has done a great deal as a university to try and connect up to and provide resources to local communities. And that changes the perception a little bit, but resentments will also still be there. So I think political identity is certainly being reshaped by this process. There are other political questions with smart cities in the sense that smart cities are extremely divisive politically and amongst urban professionals. There are some who are squarely in favor and some who are very much against. And part of the problem is that one is that we don't really have a very strong definition of what a smart city is. And the other is that we don't actually have many successful cases of cities that were planned from scratch and that have succeeded. And it's too soon to tell. So there's a lot of literature on China's ghost cities. China is kind of the classic case. But some critics say, well, these cities have failed. They were meant to house so many people and they were meant to attract so many people and they didn't. And that's that. And other people are saying, well, no, actually, it's just that that growth has not happened yet, but inevitably it will. And these cities will become populated and they will become functional. But I think in order to think about so if the question is about what the prospects are for smart cities, I think we have to figure out how are we going to avoid what kind of time frame are we giving? How reasonable is it? And how are we going to avoid what has happened in China? Um, and if we don't sort of think about those questions, then I think we are dealing with the prospect of a lot of political disappointment. And I'm sorry, the second question that you'd asked was about electoral politics. I don't see this. I mean, electoral structures are not changing, right? Because the jurisdictions are not changing. So unless the city's territory changes, the electoral politics doesn't change that much. But that's also a problem because then, for example, as governments become more collaborative and they connect to each other more, people who are affected by the decisions of an urban government don't necessarily have a say in that urban government. And we see this between Delhi and Haryana, right? So Haryana voters don't get a say in Delhi government.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. My next question is a text question, which is urbanization, boon or bane?
Mhm. Well, it's I think with any question like this, it's always we always have to ask for whom. So some of us, I would include myself among them, are people who have benefited a great deal from urbanization, right? The entire lifestyle that one has, being in a space like Jindal University, having the kind of education that one has had, all of these have been enabled by urbanization. So, um, and urbanization has provided a lot of economic opportunities, and there are just certain features of contemporary life that we wouldn't have without urbanization, right? Even the global media that we consume and enjoy, and economic globalization absolutely needs urbanization. It's impossible to imagine any of the mainstays of the world economy now, the globalized economy, without urbanization, right? But I think it really depends on who are we asking, who are we asking about. So, um, for example, in New York City, where I used to live, uh, there were the popular story is that indigenous people, Native Americans, sold New York to, but in fact there was, and for a necklace of beads or something like that. And in fact there was an agreement, but the agreement was understood differently on both sides because the idea of property was different on both sides. And so if you ask Native Americans from those communities who are still living in those communities, for them the urbanization of New York has been more of a bane in the sense that it was the loss of their land and community and so on. So yeah, I think it depends on who you're asking.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My next question is it's regarding the curriculum, and I think this question is asked to the right person because you were at the forefront of designing the curriculum for political science. So the question is, do the students have the opportunity wherein they can take this topic as one of their main subjects while they study political science?
Hmm. Absolutely. So we don't presume anything other than that you've finished your class 12. We don't assume what stream you're from, and we want an equal playing field for everybody. So you don't have to have done social sciences or political science. And you can still come and do the BA. All of the foundational concepts will be taught. So this talk today was based more on urban politics will come up more as an upper level elective, but we also just, we understand that everybody's coming from very different backgrounds and contexts. So one of the things that we've done, which I think is kind of unique amongst political science programs in India, is we are teaching academic reading and writing for a year as well. Um, and that's because, for political science, so many other subjects are vital, right? The way that you learn to think if you've done science is going to be useful. It's not just a deficit, but it's something that will be useful for how you think. It has already given you a way of looking at the world, and we want that in the classroom. We want that kind of diversity of perspectives because people will think about questions in different ways, and then the conversation that happens as a result is so much more interesting. um, and it generates new insights, and sometimes it's great because you're teaching a class as a professor, and a conversation between two students gives you a new angle on something. So we want that, and we work on teaching the skills that you will need to do whatever it is that you want to do, right? So right from the first year we are sort of deciding what those skills are, and the idea is that by the third year you'll be deciding what those skills are, and we'll help you craft your curriculum. But we absolutely don't assume that anybody needs to have done any specific subject in order to do a BA with us.
Thank you so much. My next question is, I read out the question to you. As India urbanizes, it's at a crossroad to choose to go the way cities in the Middle East have gone, or they have a choice to go in the direction similar to Hong Kong, which emphasizes productivity and uniformity over creativity and safe space. Which way would you think India would go?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, and I like that question also because for once it's not just comparing India's trajectory to how do we become like America or Europe, thank God. um, but it's asking, these are all reasonable comparisons. I think part of the problem right now is that when we say India is at a crossroads to choose around urbanization, is actually we're seeing a weakening of planning, and that's happening all over India. And I think that is a mistake. I think that the way that urban planning is proceeding, there needs to be a more sort of research-based, comprehensive vision. And part of the problem is the way that bureaucratic structures have changed. So this isn't about one party or another. It's about the fact that as bureaucratic decentralization happens more and more and projects become more and more small scale, you will have people coming in and changing a site and being very thoughtful and intentional about how they do it. But it's not connecting up to a broader vision of what the city is becoming or what the city should be, because there isn't a centralized office working on that anymore, or not in the way that it used to. And more of those decisions are becoming decentralized. So I think the problem is, so part of the problem then is sort of what is possible. um, I certainly, I would say with cities in the Middle East, it depends on which cities we're talking about. So, I think there are places where there are, there is also some emphasis on productivity and uniformity. But yes, by and large, there's more of a sense there. I think that those major cities are historical cities, and so they've retained their historical identity. A place like Hong Kong, um, which emphasizes productivity and uniformity over creative and safe spaces, which way would suit. See, my this is my normative commitment, is I think safe spaces should be everywhere, right? So that people, the inhabitants of a city, should have some basic safety no matter where they are. And in terms of productivity and uniformity, that's going to be very difficult in a country with such a large informal sector. And I think that one of the insights of a lot of contemporary urban theory coming from the global south is that instead of seeing the informal sector as a problem, we should learn to start working with them and learn from their ways of getting around things, right? We will never have, India maybe somewhere down the line will be a rich enough country to do the kinds of things that rich countries do. But for those of us who are not coming from like for those of us in the global south, we have a different set of challenges, and informality, I think, has to be worked with. And we have to understand that no vision will be perfectly executed. So it doesn't make sense to have a perfect vision of efficiency because I think we're just not there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the answer. My next question, which starts with a statement is like, in the process of urbanization, we have
Mhm.
started accepting, we have become modern, and we have started accepting a lot of things. But
Mhm.
still, in a country like India, we still see there is a resistance, there's a hesitation in accepting the LGBT community. So, what is your view on this?
Yes. So, well, I'm teaching a class right now. I'm teaching two classes, one on cities and infrastructure and one on global LGBTQ politics. And the common explanation is that LGBTQIA plus acceptance goes against various cultures. But in fact, I think there's a political process by which that idea is being produced. So one thing we're dealing with in India is the legacies of colonialism, right? Colonialism went into creating the homophobic laws in the first place. And that's not just in India. I mean, actually, if you read, uh, there's a wonderful writer from Uganda named Sylvia Tamale, who is a dean, who is the dawn of a university there, which is like a dean. And she was publicly persecuted after she came out just making a statement in support of LGBTQ. So she herself is not identifying that way, and the backlash she got was severe, and it was very similar to what we see all around the world, right? Like, this is not part of our culture. And she has this whole argument about how actually, in fact, like, there are all these historical ways in which it was part of the cultures that were there before colonialism, but the legal structure has been inherited from colonialism, and then people kind of internalize that, believing that whatever the law says is in some way the will of the people, or a reflection of culture, rather than as something that also shapes it. But the other thing is that I think national identities now, like, ever since the 80s and the AIDS crisis, LGBTQ politics has become political in a global way, and so countries are positioning themselves in certain ways, and and it's a geopolitical positioning. So there's actually some good work on how, Russia is an interesting case of this, where they frame their homophobia as opposition to the West, but also opposition to the East. So they frame it as a kind of benevolent homophobia, as if to say, we're homophobic, but we're not like those other Muslim countries in the East, like Chechnya and so on. We're better than them. We're just, opposed, but in a benevolent way, but we're also not like the decadent West. So I think all these sort of moral panics about sexuality, right? They actually serve a geopolitical function, and I think that then leads to a kind of popular discourse around them as well. So I think, that yes, we have to kind of take the hearts and minds approach, and if you want to change that, but I think it goes beyond that to also understanding a little bit how different governments position themselves. And I think India is doing different things when it comes to gender versus sexuality, but there are a lot of criticisms also of the transgender law, um, in the way that it's defining and kind of trying to refix gender rather than move towards a fluid concept.
Thank you so much. I will take the last two questions now, and in case if we do not answer to any questions, we will get back to you.
Mhm.
My next question is how concepts like modern and beauty, how are they realized in terms of city planning?
Hmm. Okay, um, that's a very interesting question. Um, I mean, city planning was fundamentally a modernist project at the beginning. The whole idea of modernism was about rationality and about grand visions and about being able to sit with a map and produce some kind of work of art. And that was actually the understanding of art, right? So this vision of this, striving towards a kind of perfect rationality and rationalization of the urban environment is very much a modernist vision. And planning actually comes out of modernism, not the other way around. It's not that people said, let's plan the city, and then modernism came into the picture. So planning and modernity, I think, are very much intertwined, because before that, city growth and development was much more chaotic. Beauty is a very different question, because that changes. So I don't know if you've heard about this, but Donald Trump wanted to set up, I think it's called the neoclassical style, as the style for all government buildings. And he doesn't like brutalist buildings. So brutalist buildings brutalism is a type of a type of aesthetic that we would associate with like a kind of hypermodernism, right? And it also has a socialist past. Brutalism was popular in both the Soviet and the capitalist blocs. So for Donald Trump, I think it's there's a very clear kind of politics in how he defines beauty in many ways, and architecture is certainly one of them. But I think the short answer, the attempt to create a short answer would be that beauty is aesthetics themselves are political, and so there's always a specific type of political vision being realized or communicated through planning and architecture. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but yeah, these things are also always taken into account in city planning. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. My last question to you is I read out the question. With
Hmm.
respect to increased weaponization of laws like Disturbed Areas Act, what does the future of urbanization hold for cities like Ahmedabad or a Cuttack, where segregation persists and shapes many other aspects of the cities?
Hmm. So this is going back to, I've been, as we watch events unfold, I've been thinking a lot about this. And there is a book I would recommend called Rebel Cities by David Harvey, which I've been finding uh, some sort of i- opening for another way to think about this than what the dominant media framing is, which is which is also necessarily very focused on the short term. But I think um, as much as urbanization has gone hand in hand with militarization and with the use of these kinds of laws, there are two things we have to remember. One is that those laws are old. My grandmother actually grew up in Cuttack, and she grew up under colonialism, and her father was a freedom fighter. And so when she tells me the stories of what she grew up with and the kind of political repression, none of this is new, and we've inherited a lot of those structures as well that that governments are then able to weaponize, right? So, um, but I also think that urban space still holds a type of potential for mobilization. And also for ways of acting on the environment. And David Harvey has a very good account of specifically what he thinks is needed. It's one vision of this, but specifically what he thinks are kind of the elements of urban space that allow for more democratic mobilizations, even under conditions of, you know, um, even under conditions of government control or in authoritarian context and so on. The other problem is that I think lockdown and coronavirus are radically changing um, even these understandings of urbanization, because we will first have to, if urbanization itself changes, if we actually get to a point where there's an attempt to kind of reverse it, then or contain it, and to break down the structures of the city in order to prevent another pandemic, because there are also predictions that coronavirus is not going to be the only problem, then I think we'll be facing a very different set of political questions. And then I think it's also, my hope is that when that happens, that people who are thinking about urban politics will have some role to play in that as well.
Thank you so much. And with this, I would like to conclude today's webinar. I thank you all the participants who have turned up on a Monday morning to attend the webinar. And as I said, we will come up with such interesting topics. I know, some of you might be receiving a lot of requests from other universities in regards to webinars, and you might be, in the dilemma of, what to choose. But I would suggest you, the topics that we try and come up with are interesting and are relevant to what we are going to take up post August 2020. So I would request you to stay tuned with us, and we will come up with If you have any questions even after the topic, if you want to know what books to refer, what you can do during this lockdown, how you can prepare yourself, you can always write back to us. With this, I thank you. I thank Dr. Das for the very informative session and presentation today. And I once again thank you all the participants and all my colleagues. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you.